Today, we are pleased to welcome Pica Johansson from the Alan Turing Institute. Pica is a researcher on the online safety team at the Turing, where her work focuses on online hate and abuse, misinformation, extremism, and the uptake of safety technologies.
Thank you so much for having me here today for the first seminar of the year and for organizing this series of lectures. As Ken mentioned, I will be presenting on some of the work that we are doing at the Alan Turing Institute, specifically focusing on this ongoing project, which we call the Online Harms Observatory. It is a project aimed at policymakers, but it very much leverages our expertise within data science and AI. So first of all, I don't want to spend too long speaking about myself, but hopefully this contextualizes how I approach these problems and in particular, the ones that I'll be speaking about in context of the perspectives that I'm kind of sharing here today. So I'm a research associate at the Alan Turing Institute. I very much focus on applied research. I previously worked with communications analytics at the United Nations, where I did very similar work to what I am doing here today. So always having this very data-driven focus with the kind of the thought that this should always be applied and used in the real world. So for example, I've been quite involved with the forthcoming online safety bill, which is currently passing through Parliament. And of course, I also want to mention that I am LC alumni and graduated a few years ago from the Data and Society cohort. So for this presentation, I will be talking you through kind of four main sections. First, I will be speaking about the Alan Turing Institute and giving a bit of insight into our work here more generally before introducing the Online Harms Observatory. The observatory in itself, I will be speaking about in its most recent and first application, which is the abuse faced by Premier League footballers online. After that, I will be just briefly touching on a few new research areas we have and applications for the observatory in the future. And then we'll be ending with a Q&A. So to kick us off with some context, the Alan Turing Institute is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI. It was founded in 2015, and it is really aiming to be a national institute with partnerships across the UK with these 13 partner universities that we currently have, and it was founded by 5 of these originally. The Alan Turing Institute's mission is to make great leaps in data science and artificial intelligence research in order to change the world for the better. And this is a mission that is reflected across our core research areas, including health and medicine, urban analytics, and defense and security. So the team that I'm here to represent the work of today is the online safety team, and it sits within the public policy program. So the public policy program in itself works with loads of interesting projects, all aimed to improve the provision of public services with help of data science and AI. And in this specific case, it is the application of AI to improve policymaking for the benefit of online safety. So we really sit in this nexus between applied machine learning and really using it to investigate pressing questions within the social sciences. So in our case, this is online abuse, misinformation, extremism, and kind of related topics. I'll be discussing these kind of throughout the presentation, but this is generally what we mean when we discuss harms in context of our research. And then of course, we have this policymaking aspect to it, where we really try to have our findings and our research be applied in the real world and having it influence policymaking in the UK, but also far beyond the UK, as these are areas that a lot of governments are currently trying to tackle. So this is a video that I'll just briefly start by showing you to help explain some of our core work streams. And I hope the animation explains how we are attempting to tackle online safety.
In recent years, it has become increasingly clear that some types of online content and activity can cause real harm with serious consequences for people all around the world. From child abuse to hate speech, misinformation to suicide and self-harm, the online world presents a range of challenges. Solving online abuse is a complex problem, and it is still unclear how to chart a path forward. How do we balance the duty to protect victims whilst also protecting freedom of speech, the right to privacy, and an open internet? The Alan Turing Institute is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. We are their online safety team, part of the Turing's public policy programme. Our team of researchers is providing evidence-driven insight into the technical, social, empirical, and ethical aspects of online safety, supporting the work of policymakers and regulators, informing civic discourse and extending academic knowledge. We want to make a breakthrough in online safety through the responsible use of advanced digital technology by interrogating, critiquing, improving, and ultimately deploying artificial intelligence to stop online hate, harassment, extremism, and misinformation. Our work is structured around 3 pillars: data-centric AI for online safety, the Online Harms Observatory, and policymaking for online safety. Artificial intelligence is sometimes seen as the silver bullet that will solve the problem of online safety. It offers a scalable, cost-effective, and reproducible way of finding harmful content, which can support content moderation, monitoring, and threat evaluation. However, the artificial intelligence used in content moderation has lots of limitations. It is often fragile, underperforming, and biased. It also has limits to its scope and can easily be tricked. We are charting a new course for data-centric AI in online safety, an approach which emphasizes dynamic training and retraining of models, innovative methods, and rigorous evaluation, helping to create tools that are high-performing, robust, and explainable. We also produce publicly available resources like datasets, guidelines, and dashboards that can be used by the research community. The online safety team's goal is to mobilize our findings and put our models to the test in real-world scenarios. To do so, we are building an online harms observatory in collaboration with the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. The observatory comprises live dashboards, which provide insight into the prevalence, dynamics, and impact of content and activity that could inflict harm on people online. The dashboards and analyses are available to policymakers, regulators, and other stakeholders to help them make evidence-driven decisions to improve online safety. Our first dashboard tracks the abuse targeted at Premier League footballers. The second looks at abuse directed towards British MPs. If you would like access to the observatory, reach out to us. There are no easy solutions or shortcuts to solving online harms, but positive developments are on the horizon. A growing community of researchers, policymakers, regulators, politicians, and tech organizations have stepped up to meet the challenge of ensuring online safety. Society is showing greater awareness, and whistleblowers are sounding the alarm bell to call out cases where big tech has failed. Now, in early 2022, the Online Safety Bill is making its way into law in the UK's Parliament, and Ofcom is preparing to become the online harms regulator. Through our work on policy making for online safety, we engage with a range of stakeholders and communities, facilitating the translation of research into practice. We aim to make our findings digestible and accessible, directly supporting the people who can make best use of our work. We are passionate about online safety and want to push the boundaries of research, developing practical tools and actionable insights. We are proud to be collaborating with other groups that share our passion, including Ofcom and the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, as well as advising the UK Parliament on the forthcoming Online Safety Bill. Are you interested in working with us to ensure online safety? We are always looking for new partners. Let's team up.
So on that note, I hope that I've introduced kind of the wide range of work that we work on here at the Turing and not least within the online safety team. As I mentioned, I'll be really focusing on one of these pieces, but I do really believe that for research to be effective and for it to land in the hands of people that really can make decisions based off of it, we do really need this joint up approach. So I'll kind of be going back and forth between these areas throughout the presentation. But first of all, in general about the Online Harms Observatory, it is a project that started as an idea about 1.5 years ago as a reaction to that we kept hearing that policymakers needed trustworthy and up-to-date evidence about the prevalence of online harms, not least in the run-up to the forthcoming online safety bill. So the online safety bill is something that you might not be familiar with. I'll be mentioning it a bit, so I just briefly wanted to cover what it does. It is a bill that is passing through Parliament, which attempts to regulate social media, as well as search engines to prevent harm arising to people in the UK. It has primary duties to protect children online, but it does also cover other offenses considered illegal, such as content which references extreme sexual violence or contains extreme sexual violence, other content that constitutes maybe hate crime or incites violence or is fraudulent in some way. This is a ever evolving and very, very long list of offenses, so I won't mention all of them, but those are a few of them. So if we look at these organizations, it is by no means an exhaustive list, but it does exemplify some of the actors and organizations that we want to support by providing an increasingly important evidence base for the many, many harms that do exist online. And we kind of envisioned that the solution would be the Online Harms Observatory as a set of dashboards that exist online that are each dedicated to a target of abuse or a type of harm. And as part of the Turing, we really believe that we are uniquely placed to produce these dashboards because we can offer the rigor of academia, but we can deliver these dashboards at an increased speed and with much more flexibility, as well as having these relationships with regulators and policymakers. And what I'm presenting today is really already based off a lot of the research that we have and continue to publish in peer-reviewed venues. So really what we're doing is we're baking in a lot of the research that we're already doing into deployable models that we are putting in the hands of policymakers and decision makers kind of across the UK and beyond. So I guess returning to this trinity, we hope to be able to provide the scale of machine learning, the rigor of social science, and the impact of policymaking. And how we plan to expand these dashboards is by looking at some of these metrics. So first of all, being able to speak to the prevalence and how much of various types of content exist on various platforms, being able to speak to some of the trends, the resonance and the engagement, as well as getting some insight into the perpetrators and how audiences are reacting to some of these types of content. And then, of course, looking at the networks in which this content diffuses. So then, as we plan to add various types of harm, we are planning to create more trackers and more dashboards, which really works across these verticals with insight into these key topics that we're researching. So that is primarily hate, personal abuse, extremism, and misinformation. So the application that I mentioned already and that the animation touched on that we started with was kind of in the wake of the Euros, where we saw that there was a lot of primarily racist abuse that came out when England was in the finals. So this was a report that DCMS together with Ofcom really started pushing for after that, and we decided that this would be our first case study to see how something like this could be done. So as I mentioned, Ofcom and DCMS were some of the main stakeholders, but this is also something that has echoed much further. And basically all major outlets in the UK covered this report when it was first published. And we felt really lucky to have our research get this kind of exposure, which is quite rare for academic publications. And it kind of inspired us to be able to put out more research which reaches large audiences and really can reach people who might not otherwise be engaged in this research or necessarily know about the scope and how much of it there is actually out there. And beyond the UK, we also had this kind of touch on in many, many different countries all across the world, including Sweden, which is where I'm from. So that was quite exciting for me and the team to follow. So for the next 10 minutes or so, I'll be talking about the methodology that underpins the OHO. And the first step was really to collect the data and identify the target group or harm on the specific platform that we wanted to be working with. So far for this specific tracker, we use Twitter. And of course, this is due to its convenience, but also for this specific report, we of course studied the abuse faced by public figures. And as they are very present on the platform, it also is the perfect platform to be using for this type of analysis. We basically started streaming in real time all the tweets that were mentioning various Premier League football players, all 618 of them. And this resulted in a database, once we'd kind of gone through this, had a first parse about 2.3 million tweets. And what we spend a huge amount of time thinking about at the Turing, especially with this type of projects, is what we call data-centric AI, and thinking about the quality of the data that we put into our models. So when we think about AI in a lot of popular references, we don't really think about data as a key component, but in reality, obviously AI really does consist both of the model and the data it learns from. So we believe that excellent AI is built on data of the highest quality and is really the most fundamental ingredient to any machine learning system. So when we think about this prescribed wisdom in the field, garbage in, garbage out, we really think about how our models can ever be as good as the data that we train them off of. And if we don't really get this step right, we also won't have a good model. But the models can't be learned from raw data per se, which is why we use supervised machine learning, in which the data can be labeled before our model can actually learn something from it. And this, of course, involves humans. And humans act as the teachers in supervising the model by labeling these examples that we want the model to understand. And in our case, this was differentiating between positive tweets, abusive tweets, critical tweets, and neutral tweets. This is also what we call data annotation. But of course, when we then think about that there are humans that have to make all these decisions before the model can do it, human resources are of course really expensive, but it's also really psychologically damaging for annotators to sit and parse through all of this data. So one of the key questions become how we best make use of human resources to teach our AR model the distinction between these four categories that we set up. So when it came to the model training step, we used a combination of active learning and adversarial learning. And both of these strategies are human in the loop strategies, as they're called, and they're very data efficient, because basically the model tells you between each round of training what it needs more of to improve. And then we top it off with something called adversarial learning in the end, which I'll continue talking about for the next few minutes. So in effect, this means that we have various sampling strategies, the first of them being something called uncertainty sampling. And this process always starts with a simple model. So we train a simple model, and then we use statistics to identify which tweets confuse the model. So if you think about all the entries that we are trying to label, we can think about them as squares. So those represent abuse, and we can think about them as diamonds, which represent non-abusive entries. And in the case of uncertainty sampling, the sampling method basically tells us that these entries within the purple area, these are entries that the model is unsure of how to classify. And these all fall around what we call the decision boundary. So we are able to pick up these entries, model them by hand, annotate them by hand, and then send them back to the model to retrain the model. So in effect, the model chooses what data to learn from. We then have another type of sampling strategy, which is called diversity sampling. And diversity sampling is instead when the model tells us, oh, we've never seen cases of this before. So for example, we have these two orange cases that are very far from decision boundary and also very far from any other tweets. So we then take these labels, these entries and label them, annotate them, and send them back to the model. But for adversarial learning, we use this, the best model based on our multiple rounds of active learning. In this case, we used 3. And then we top it up and tweak the model by using synthetic entries. So entries that we've come up with ourselves to trick the model. So the aim is always to trick the model. And this means that the model learns from what it is in effect worst at classifying instead. And again, this is something that humans are needed for. So I have a small diagram to kind of illustrate how this works. So throughout the process, we as a team are manually checking the quality of the model predictions. And by doing that, we find some weak points or like other areas of vulnerability where we think that the model might not be performing as well. So for example, that can be in the distinction that we had between criticism and abuse. And that's even for humans a really, really fine line. So for the model to be able to handle these cases well when it's deployed, we need to find these edge cases. So where it is really unclear and teach our model about them. So we start with these annotators, and then we enter a non-abusive statement that you might think the model will predict as abusive. And in this case, we use a swear word, but to describe the weather and not the player that the tweet is mentioning. So you would think that if you feed this to the model, a poorly calibrated model might overfit to the swear word and predict that this is of the abusive class, which is kind of the idea with giving it the statement at the beginning. We assume that it might not understand this nuance. But then the model kind of says, oh, actually, we predicted the correct class with this very, very high confidence. So you also do that in kind of the reverse, so trying to trick it with an abusive statement. So here you enter an abusive statement that you think the model will predict as non-abusive. For example, using emoji representations, which it might be difficult for the model to understand. So again, we feed this example to the model to get a prediction. And then we actually fool the model. So the whole point, again, is to trick the model by being able to find these weaknesses. So we retrain it based on the mistakes that it shows us that it's making. And ultimately, this makes it a much better and robust model in the end. And what's quite interesting here is as we can see in this precision recall kind of trade-off curve, when we evaluate the model against a held out validation set, is that, for each line, the way to read this model or this graph is for each time the line moves out, we get the same precision for more recall. And then we can see the difference between the purple line and the pink line. So basically the purple line is after 3 rounds of active learning, and the pink line is the improvement that we got based on this last bit of adversarial learning where we top the model up, which is really only a few hundred entries. And that just means that it's a hugely effective strategy to calibrate the model and make it so much better, especially considering that for each other round of training, we used 2,000 entries. So to get where we were on the purple line, we needed about 6,000 entries. And then we only with using about, I think it was 250 extra entries, we get that additional improvement in the model. So finally, once we have this model, we can apply this AI at scale, meaning that we use the custom model to infer classes on new data. Next, we visualize the data in this customizable dashboard format, which I'll shortly be showing you. And this is basically the step that we've gotten to at this point. So we're speaking to a lot of stakeholders to get more information about what they need. And we are really curious to hear about especially new areas of interest when it comes to both domains. So various types of abuse, as well as the targets of abuse. So who this abuse or this harm is targeting. But we're also using this opportunity to test the model with various stakeholders and see if it's actually even doing what we're expecting it to do and what they might need it for. So we're kind of both looking at improving our dashboards in terms of adding more metrics to it, or analysis that is easier to kind of ingest as someone who's sitting on the other side and as a user, but also looking into kind of how can we develop this type of dashboard further by looking at other areas that might be of interest to policymakers. Another kind of feedback that we're getting, and we can really see the value in is of course that we have all of this data and these classifications and this tool at hand to be able to classify and understand what's happening basically in real time for events that we want to have some kind of understanding of much, much earlier than the academic cycle would ever allow us to get. So for example, The Guardian reached out to us during the World Cup and asked if we could have an analysis ready, 2 hours after the final game that England played in. And that's something that we have basically at the click of a button when we've gone through all this model training and have this kind of active, just running in the background, and able to use it then to pull out some findings and help, both the public, but also just try to engage people in this question more generally to raise awareness and make sure that it stays on the agenda as such an important one. So our next step will be launching it. This will be done by rolling out kind of a beta version within the next month or so. If you know someone who might be interested in this work or have any ideas, then of course be in touch, because this is the perfect time to really make changes. So next I will actually be demoing the OHO as it is as of right now. So I'm gonna see if I can switch my tabs. So basically this will exist as a website. It's something that I've SSH'd into right now, but the first page basically gives us an overview of history and trends. So we see a timeline that is static of how the peaks in abuse have changed over the full Premier League season. We also can see here below the types of abuse. So for example, dividing this into identity attacks and person-directed attacks. So if it's something that is directed at, say, protected characteristics such as race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and many more. But it also allows any user to export this data so that they can play around with it themselves, and also filter the data by any date. So for example, if we'd wanted for the last quarter, we can enter the dates and the graphs will update based on the inputs that I gave it. So here we can then look into more granular details when it comes to, how many total tweets did we see on a certain day, how many percentage of players received abuse in a certain day, and how many of those tweets were abusive. We also have a quick view page for someone who might not want to be playing around with the data, where we instead use it as kind of a live updating tool to see if there's anything that needs to be acted on quicker. So for example, looking at the abuse in the past 24 hours, and this is then something we compare to the previous 24 hours. We can see differences both in the total amount of tweets, the abusive tweets, the percentages of tweets that were abusive. We also then again look at the tweets that are directed at an identity, the number of players abused, the most abused player, and the top abusive hashtag. And then we have a very similar analysis for the past 7 days. And again, we're able to look at this kind of divide by how much abuse is directed towards a person, so that the person is the target, and how much of the abuse is directed towards an identity they hold. So identity directed abuse, representing the pink. And then moving on, we kind of dig into this data more by visualizing which players receive the most abuse. So really trying to understand how players might be experiencing abuse differently. So here, for example, we can see that someone at the top, someone like Cristiano Ronaldo, the size of the bubble represents the number of tweets that are directed at them in the season. So this is a player who receives a huge amount of attention and tweets. And if we then check on the axis here, we see that actually there may be loads of tweets, but a very, very small proportion of them are actually abusive, while someone who falls maybe in this part of the chart, like Kieran Clark or Michael Keane, these are players who actually don't receive a lot of tweets on any given day. So it might just be, in the tens, and then they have, say, 20% of them, as in this case, are coming through as abusive. Then of course, that's something that's going to reach them in a different way than someone like Cristiano Ronaldo. So this is a tool that we have been playing around with to be able to start looking into how these players might be targeted in different ways. We also, for the same reason, looked at if there might be any nationalities that are receiving disproportionate amounts of abuse, as well as if there might be any clubs that are receiving disproportionate amounts of abuse. And here we kind of have the same information, but plotted with the club and the nationality in the same plot. So again, really facilitating some kind of trends analysis, which I'll also be talking about a few key findings when I return to the slides. And then finally, this is also something we're still working on. We really want to be able to say something about the content and not just how much there was of any specific type of harm or type of abuse. So here we have the most used hashtags. Again, this is something that you can filter on based on a given week or a given day if you want to see something specific for a game or for a specific season. So now we have almost 2 years of this data. So that definitely expands the analysis that's possible off the back of the OHO. And then if we check down here, we can see the timeline for the most used hashtags in abusive tweets. And here we can see that towards the end of February, there was a lot mentioning Kurt Zuma, and it refers to these kind of two main categories of hashtags where there were allegations that Kurt Zuma had kicked his cat. So there were a lot of hashtags that were being used where they were kind of accusing him of being an animal abuser. And that's something that we then can pull out and report back. And then apart from this, of course, we're going to have a kind of data overview page and methodology pages that outline exactly how this has been done. But we're also right now trying to figure out, at what level do we actually allow users to be able to look at various data points with different levels of granularity, because as soon as we are working with this type of data, we of course want to make sure that it's being represented correctly and that the users of these dashboards, which are quite advanced, really understand what can be said about specific types of content or specific types of abuse based on our specific methodology. So that's also in kind of an educational piece that we continue to work with various stakeholders on. So now that I have showed you the demo, I'll just be talking you through 4 last key findings before we round off that we kind of found from this initial report. The first one being that we saw that abuse peaks in tandem with real-world events. And basically, we saw that the abuse correlates with any increase in total tweets for specific days. And this led to us conducting more of a events-based analysis, such as the one that I just mentioned with Kurt Zuma and the animal abuse allegations. So for example, here in our large sample of 2.3 million tweets, we saw that there was a huge spike when Cristiano Ronaldo transferred to Manchester United. And on the same day, we saw a huge spike in abusive tweets. And of course, this huge spike might misrepresent the data slightly or skew the data in a way that it looks like these other peaks aren't as significant. But of course, it's just that this happens to be an incredible outlier, and there are loads of peaks and troughs kind of within this data. But when we have analyzed it, we have seen that it has been highly correlated with the total tweets for a specific day. So any big media moment, a big match, something that comes out in the press, usually are drivers of abuse in this space. So next, we saw that a very large number of users actually abuse a small number of players. So in that way, the abuse is quite skewed as well. So here we really tried to focus on who is sending the abuse and diving into the dynamics of abuse by trying to figure out if it actually is the case that there are a lot of abuse super spreaders, because that's something that's commonly cited. This idea that there are, small number of users who spread loads of this abuse, but actually what we can see in the graph to the left is that there's a large proportion of users who account for the bulk of the abuse. So about 17% of the users, they have, they amount to about 40% of the total abusive tweets. And then if we look at the other chart on the right side, we see that it's actually only 12 players who receive the majority of the abuse. So then if we think about that we were looking at over 600 players in total, then it's actually a very, very small number of users. So if we'd want to go in and start doing something in this space, and having policymakers act on this, or trying to kind of correct the narrative that we currently see in a lot of media in particular, then actually the people that maybe we should start focusing on is these 12 players, and really have mobilize or have extra support for them, as they are really clearly the large receivers of this abuse. And then the second to last finding that I'm pulling out today is this idea of that players have really differing experiences of abuse online. And this goes back to the chart that I showed you earlier, which basically just shows that, of course, depending on where you find yourself on this chart, you'll have an incredibly different experience of being online as someone who is in the limelight. So someone like Kieran Clark, James MacArthur, Benjamin Mendy, these are users that these are players that over a whole season only received, tweets in the hundreds. So this isn't even one tweet a day, or maybe even just one tweet a day. And then they have kind of these bursts of tweets that come through in very short time periods that are incredibly abusive. And that might then, make up for up to 35% of the total tweets that they're receiving during a season. And finally, which I've also kind of been alluding to, we started looking into this idea of identity attacks. And we saw that they actually comprise a really small percentage of the abuse received. So these are references that mention a player's identity. So something like a protected characteristic, such as the ones I've mentioned. And we saw that it actually only represented 2% of all tweets. But if you think about how many tweets that is in effect, that's of course still 5,000 tweets. And they do reference someone's identity in a harmful way. And that in itself is clearly 5,000 tweets too many, but as a overall percentage, it is much smaller than maybe what we would have expected. So finally, just rounding off, I have two kind of streams of research that I will be talking you through, both for the future of the Online Harms Observatory, but also research that we are doing in the online safety team more general. So as I've mentioned, we're looking into new domains, and we are currently labeling data both for the abuse that MPs experience, as well as the abuse that female footballers experience. And when we're discussing this, we're really thinking about how to best move forward in terms of either working with a generalist model or potentially having more of like a horizontal expansion into multiple specialist models. And that, of course, becomes a question of transfer learning. So how much data do we need for an effective transfer? And right now we're working with the male footballers data, the male footballers model, and we're kind of playing around with topping it off with more data either within the same domain, so within football, but targeted towards another demographic. So the female footballers, and of course, we expect to see another type of abuse there. So it might be best to have a dedicated model for that. But for the sake of understanding how these models work, we think it's really important to see that if something, say, for example, misogyny is something that can be picked up by a male footballers model, or how much data do we need to add to be able to also understand the dynamics within the abuse that female footballers experience. And then the same idea is basically applied to see if we can transfer the knowledge that we know within the male footballers tracker to a completely different domain. So the domain transfer would basically be looking at MPs and seeing if a model trained on the type of abuse experienced by footballers could potentially predict and give accurate labels for the abuse that MPs face. And this is something, again, that we're still labeling up, and we're still trying to figure out how to do efficient data transfers. But so far, we are probably aiming towards some kind of generalist model in the long run. But for now, building out these specialist models based on also kind of what our user groups are telling us and what various stakeholders seem most interested in next. And inspired kind of by this project, we have another project that we call our Cheap Learning Project, in which we really try to, we're basically writing up a paper to see how we can inspire more machine learning in social sciences. So primarily targeting researchers who might have limited experience with coding, they might be experiencing data scarcity problems, or they might be working with limited resources in other ways. And for the purpose of that project, we're basically comparing very data efficient strategies that also don't require huge resources, such as transfer learning, which I just mentioned. We're also working with prompt engineering and weak supervision. And then finally, the last project that we're working on in this space, and that might benefit the observatory, is to explore the advantages and concerns and potential areas for future research if we use synthetic data. So as machine learning has a huge problem with data scarcity, and also synthetic data is known to be kind of riddled with bias in the same way that real data is, that's something that we want to be open to exploring, but also being very aware of maybe where some of these pitfalls are and where the limits of using synthetic data for efficient model training might lay. The other areas that we are currently looking into is this more solutions-oriented research. So that's also tightly kind of coupled with our current relationships with policymakers. And we recently had published a preprint on a paper titled "How Can We Combat Online Misinformation, a systematic overview of current interventions and their efficacy." So this is a line of research which basically creates a framework for all the interventions we know of right now used to tackle misinformation, and discusses their efficacy based on studies primarily within social psychology. So based off of this research, we're also creating a survey, and this is a survey which questions to what degree users actually have experience with these interventions, because we know that they all exist, but we don't actually know if it's something that users either are aware of, are using, or if they take to heart, or when they're interacting in the online space. The final survey that we are working on has a similar goal, but is instead aimed to understand to what degree existing online safety or features for online safety are used on social media. So something like hiding likes, changing the feed on social media from chronological to algorithmic or vice versa, which is often the case, to what degree people use reporting functions, and really trying to understand to what degree a lot of the technology that exists to make the online safe space safer actually is used and interacted with in the real world, because there's lots of research going on here, but it's quite difficult to say to what degree there's an uptake of these technologies. So based on that, thank you so much. Please read the report, and I believe we'll move on to a Q&A now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Pica. That was wonderful, really exciting. And I think what I really like about your work here is the way it's so connected through from the, getting the stakeholders involved at the beginning, and then thinking hard about the data first before diving in and doing the modeling, but then connecting it up with that dashboard and all the way back through to the stakeholders and the policymakers at the end. So that's super exciting. And we have questions flooding in already, which is great. So I will ask the questions that are in the chat. Please do feel free, everybody, to add your own questions in the chat. Or if you would like to ask a question in real time, then do just put your virtual hand up and I will come to you. Okay, so we'll kick off.
To answer them to the best of my ability.
Yeah, we've got lots coming in. So
Amazing.
if I can try to group them together a bit, we've got a couple of questions about the accuracy of the model. So you showed that step graph with how the model was performing after the different iterations, and got a question about false positives, for example, or what trends you've observed. I wondered if you could say a bit more about the accuracy of the model. What is it good at and what is it not good at, perhaps?
So I would say in general, we see that a lot of the abuse that comes through that is classified as abuse is, of course, criticism towards, because this is football players. It's a lot of tweets that are criticizing players in very aggressive ways. And I think the line that we're still really trying to figure out, where we're getting a lot of false positives, is criticism that might be warranted in some way, or that's very, very clearly expressed, but that uses profanities, or in other ways use language which is associated with very abusive tweets. So I think in that regard, we're still struggling a little bit, but honestly, when I've been working with the adversarial data generation, I've been very impressed. It's been, first of all, I'm not great at creating like abuse, but also
I was going to say, it must be quite hard to come up with these
really
abusive
difficult
tweets
to come up
examples
with
to
a lot
type
of
down.
examples, but when I do try to click it, it's been doing surprisingly well.
Yep. Great, that's good to hear. Okay, so I'll take the other technical question as well at the same time. So for the classification step, how are the tweets represented? Ben asks, how do LLMs and sentence embeddings compare to more simple vectorization methods such as bag of words or TF-IDF? I'm not sure what that stands for.
So I'll try to give as generic as an answer as possible, but basically when we're using something like a LLM, which we're using that kind of underpins the architecture of these models, we're able to take context into account in a way that a bag of words approach can't necessarily do. So basically a bag of words, for those who aren't familiar with the terms, it's basically representing the underlying corpus as a literal bag of words where you just throw all the words in together. And you might not understand if a word that has multiple meanings is used in various ways. I might not be able to discern the differences between that. So therefore, if you use something where you have these word embeddings or these sentence embeddings, then you can represent a little bit more of the context in which these tweets are presented.
Yep, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. We'll go to Nima Thing, who would like to ask a question. If you want to unmute yourself, Nima, and ask your question.
Sure. Thank you, Erica. And hi, Natalia. This is hi. Sorry, I couldn't pronounce the name. But hi, Professor. This is Nima from Kathmandu, Nepal. And I'm wondering about this. In this particular research, there are so many data set that is involved in, like, for example, for tutor related data, there are so many millions of data that is being used. But what if some countries doesn't have much number of exposure in those space, but you want to use computational methods to analyze those data? If you have less number of tweets or engagement in social platform, can we still leverage this kind of machine learning models to get insights in this type of research?
Yeah, so it's kind of touching on one of the last points I made about a project that where we're trying to see if there are certain strategies for like cheap learning, so learning that is easier to do without large sets of data. And of course, there are some pre-trained models that actually do perform very well, where that do but model hate. So if you use some of these existing large language models that are not on one specific domain, but just tries to look for hate and classify hate more generally, usually you might not need to use that much additional data to get at least decent results. It might not be as great as if you have more data to use to fine-tune the model. But for example, on Hugging Face, there are models like HateBERT and other BERT models that exist that can be used to do some kind of fine-tuning in the end, or just to use, I wouldn't say out of the box, because it's always great to be able to do something, but even something like Google's Perspective, which I saw someone mentioned in the chat, is a great generalist model for identifying various types of abuse if you want to be using computational methods but don't have that much resources of your own to build these models.
Great, thank you. We'll come to Gabriella next. So I think you're going to ask about different platforms. We have several questions about different platforms, including TikTok and YouTube. Gabriella, do you want to ask your question as well?
Yes, thank you. My question is also in the chat. So the first question was about perspective, which I think you already addressed. And the second question was, yes, if how does this extend to other platforms? For example, YouTube, I know it's a good source for abusive comments under the videos that are related to football or soccer. So how does this compare? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So our model currently is obviously trained on Twitter, but it would also be possible to use, if we had access to data from other platforms, which is usually a huge problem in these areas, that to get access to these platforms, either you need to do some kind of manual scraping or access it via APIs. And if you have API access now, for example, I know Twitter has the largest API access for the longest time. That's also why a lot of researchers use it. But TikTok is building an API right now, and that way we could definitely use some of those comments and see how well the model does on them. I think my main concern would be that tweets are of a limited length, and then depending on, of course, the target of the text. So if it's a comment, it might be a different type of text or different language used than if it's a tweet, or if it's on YouTube, or if it's on Facebook. Of course, the text can vary slightly in who it's directed at or in what way it's written, and that might not be super easy for the model to understand. But then, by topping it up with small batches of data from other platforms where you have access to this data, could definitely be something that we do in the future, and it's something that we want to be doing, especially as there's more and more pressure on various platforms to get or give researchers API access. So YouTube right now, they've started an API. TikTok is currently building an API, as I mentioned. And I assume that under some of the regulation, to be honest, that we see being rolled out right now, there will be greater provisions for researchers to access data in some kind of data sharing agreement.
Fantastic. That's good news. Okay, so we have a question about the policy implications. Dennis asks, it seems at this stage that we know more about the patterns of abuse occurrence than the types of users who commit abuse. So can you say a bit more about the policy implications based on your current findings? Or maybe more widely, is there anything that your sort of stakeholders or Ofcom or these other people are particularly interested in?
I think it's a really important question. And it's also one that's very difficult because as researchers, we don't want to become like the police of these platforms. So we don't want to be, if Ofcom comes to us with questions that we don't feel comfortable answering, then we might not want to, we don't want to be sending them lists of maybe repeat offenders, even if we could, because it's not really in our, we're not really in a position where we want to be like the arbiters of what is allowed online or not, especially when it comes to the fact that these platforms set their own terms and conditions. So basically we are annotating tweets and we're building a model based on our kind of theoretical understanding or conceptualization of abuse, but that might not necessarily match to a specific platform's definition of something that's not allowed on it. And I think that's like a main, not a concern, but when it comes to really using it to do something, I don't know if we're the right people to say on like a very specific user by user there what's happening. We can say things like kind of what we saw in this research, that there are not a lot of repeat offenders. There are a lot of people that actually send one single abusive tweet, but that there's a huge amount of users that do that. So that what that means for policy might be that, okay, policymakers need to focus, they need to be directing their efforts at pressuring platforms to in some way stop people from sending these heat of the moment single abusive tweets. And I think that's how we can use this data to inform policy rather than going in on a user by user basis and speaking to kind of the dynamics in that way, but really trying to look at findings in the aggregate and kind of speak to trends that then can be used to help improve online safety.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So we have a lot of people asking if they are able to receive the presentation. So are you happy to share it with us? We are recording it and it will be available on the website afterwards. That's socialdatascience.network. You could just confirm that now, Pica.
Yeah, happy to share.
Yes. Fantastic. So for everybody who's asked, we won't be emailing it to you individually, but it will be available on our website. So do check back. Very quickly, what are the kinds of graduate programs you think would help us get into these kinds of projects? I mean, I suppose there's lots of ideas there, maybe just one or two off the top of your head, apart from obviously the LSE data science offering.
Exactly. No, I was going to say, search for anything that has to do with applied data science or social data science, or even the combination, which I know LSES, applied social data science. I think that the word having social science or applied together with something that's computational or quantitative is really where the heart of this research is at. And I know that LSE is really pushing forward as well.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much again to the speaker, the host, and everybody who asked questions. And we look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Thanks and bye-bye.